Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as hate crimes and sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls, based out of Central Florida, is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. The views and opinions expressed by podcast participants are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. This podcast content is made available for informational and educational purposes, and the VSC does not make any representation or warranties with respect to the accuracy or completeness of the content. While we make every effort to ensure that the information we are sharing is accurate, we welcome any comments, suggestions, or corrections of errors. Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here, we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma, or those who have experienced violence, and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about hate crimes against LGBTQ+ individuals. My name is Roxane Perret, my pronouns are she, her, and I am the LGBTQ+ advocate at the Victim Service Center. With me today, I have Brandon Wolf. Brandon's pronouns are he, him, and he is a survivor of the 2016 Pulse Nightclub shooting in Orlando. He is also a national advocate for LGBTQ civil rights and gun safety reform. He is the co-founder and board vice president of the Drew Project, a nonprofit organization that creates safe spaces in schools for LGBTQ youth, provides college funding, and empowers champions in the fight for equality. In 2021, Brandon was appointed to the United States Commission on Civil Rights Florida Advisory Committee, where he works to inform future civil rights policy and enforcement of existing protections. That year, he was also recognized by President Biden at an event in the Rose Garden for his work to end gun violence in America. He serves on the boards of the One Orlando Alliance and the National Organization for Victims Assistance. Brandon is currently the press secretary for Equality Florida, the state's LGBTQ civil rights organization. And with me today, I also have Eli Coston. Dr. Eli Coston's pronouns are they, them, and they are a faculty member of the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Virginia Commonwealth University. Eli is an activist scholar who received their PhD in sociology from Stony Brook University and specializing in criminology, gender and sexuality, and race and ethnicity. Their research examines how the intersections of race, class, and gender create differing experiences of marginalization and oppression for people who are LGBTQ. Eli's research identified that there was an urgent need for better data on anti-LGBTQ hate crimes. Over half of all anti-LGBTQ hate crimes go unreported to the police, and even fewer victims seek help from medical institutions or community organizations. Thus, identifying victims who forego traditional routes of reporting and help seeking is essential to understanding patterns of hate crime victimization more broadly. As a brief introduction, at the Victim Service Center, we serve survivors of all kinds of violent crimes. It is proven by research that LGBTQ+ individuals are at higher risks of being victims of violent crimes. An important kind of crime that LGBTQ+ individuals experience is hate crimes. Hate crimes are a type of crime that is motivated by prejudice on the basis of race, religion, sexual orientation, or other grounds. It's important to talk about these crimes so that survivors know that their experiences are valid and they are not alone. To start this podcast, we often begin with definitions that are important for our listeners to understand. So to start off, Brandon, can you define what LGBTQIA stands for?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for that great introduction. LGBTQIA plus is an acronym that helps to capture folks in our community. It stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, and then the plus hopes to capture anybody else that doesn't fit into those definitions.
Okay, thank you so much for that wonderful definition. Eli, can you describe what homophobia and transphobia are?
Sure, and thanks for having me. Homophobia literally means the fear of gay people, but we usually use that term homophobia more broadly to describe fear, dislike, prejudice, or discrimination towards gay or lesbian people. The term biphobia we usually use for bisexual people. And then transphobia specifically describes that experience for trans folks.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really important to know what homophobia, transphobia are in order to really understand what hate crimes are. During this episode, the Pulse tragedy will be mentioned many times. The Pulse tragedy took place in Orlando, Florida on June 12, 2016. A gunman walked into the Pulse nightclub, a popular LGBTQ plus nightclub in Orlando, and started shooting. That night, 49 LGBTQ plus and mostly Latine individuals were killed, and many more were injured. The LGBTQ plus community of Orlando is still affected to this day by this tragedy. It's important to talk about it so that the victims and survivors are never forgotten. So, Brandon, what is your connection to this work to end LGBTQ plus hate crimes?
Well, thank you. And thanks for grounding us in the human cost of hate violence. I think that's what's most important. So often when we talk about these things, we drill down into statistics and data because that helps us to address these problems in the way that they should be addressed. But it's really important that we not lose sight of the people who are most directly impacted, the people who live at ground zero of hate crimes and hate violence. I never really imagined myself being a part of this work. I didn't have grand dreams of being an advocate or an activist for my community. In fact, I really was just comfortable being normal, living a normal life, because as a young queer person of color, I was told for most of my childhood that normal was something I would never be afforded. People that I loved very much, the adults that I cared for maybe the most in the world, would tell me that the world was never going to be ready for someone like me, that I was always going to have to fit myself into a box, the definitions on a census form, that I was always going to have to constrain who I was, to mute my identities in order to assimilate into the society around me. And so I have spent most of my life just desperately trying to find a place where I could be all of me. I went off to college after graduating high school, couldn't find it there. And so in 2008, I packed 2 suitcases and I moved 3,500 miles away to Orlando, Florida, a place I had never been to before, because I was looking for somewhere that might allow me to exhale for the first time. It might sound oxymoronic to some folks, but I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and I found a lot more belonging here in Orlando, Florida than I had back home. I found it in spaces I created with my new coworkers at Disney. I found it in new foods I tried, in new languages I attempted to teach myself. And ultimately, I found that sense of belonging in chosen family. I met my best friends in 2014, and they really changed the way that I saw the world. They taught me to challenge my biases and open my eyes to new lived experiences. They questioned why I believe the things I believe, and ultimately they taught me it's okay to love you for all of you. They taught me it was okay to live at the intersections of being a queer person of color, and that rather than that being something to mute or hide away, that was my greatest strength, that was where my superpowers originated. That was the sense of normal that I had fought so hard for as a kid, the sense of normal that people told me I was never going to get a chance to have, that the world was never going to be ready to afford to me. And I found it here in Central Florida with chosen family in a beautiful new world that I had created for myself. And that's why I didn't have grand dreams of, working for a civil rights organization or fighting for my community, because a piece of me, I think, felt like when you find that sense of normal after so long being told that you were never going to have it, you just got to hold on to it. With everything you've got, you just hold on to it and ride it off into the sunset. Well, all of that normal was ripped away from me, as you noted, on one fateful night. And everything about that day and that night was normal. It was, a summer day in Florida. It was a Saturday, which meant it was laundry day. I was folding socks and underwear on the couch for much of the morning. It was warm, so I went out and laid by the pool. I fell asleep in a lounge chair. And when the sun was going down and the day was coming to a close, I did the most normal thing. I texted my best friends and asked if they wanted to get a drink. They got to my apartment just before midnight, which was normal. We, listened to the same playlist we always listened to. We watched the same music videos we always watched. One thing was different. I was never allowed to have control of the cocktail shaker because I'm terrible at it. I make drinks 2 or 3 times as strong as they need to be, but for some reason they relinquished the cocktail shaker to me that night. And honestly, when we chose where to go that night for a drink, we just picked a club that we had been to so many times before. For lots of people in our community, Pulse Nightclub was a safe space. And I know that the term safe space comes with baggage, that it can be used almost as a cudgel against people, as if to suggest that if you need a safe space, that maybe you're just not tough enough to handle the world as it is. But the truth is, for people like us, for our community, safe spaces are the lifelines we create for one another. They're the refuges that we carve out in our communities in a world that, quite frankly, threatens violence and hatred against us every single time we walk out the door. We had been to Pulse so many times before I could probably have navigated it with my eyes closed. And everything about that night at the club was normal. It was Latin night. The music was as loud as it ever was. The same drag queen who was there with a scowl on her face at the front door was there that night to snatch my $5 out of my hand. There was this beaded doorway you would part and you went into the crowded floor. The bass was as heavy underneath the hardwood as it always was. We went to the same bartender we always went to, ordered the same drinks we always ordered. We had this spot on the patio. It was our spot, our normal spot, underneath the stars. And my best friend, Drew, who had a master's degree in clinical psychology, would, after a drink or two, offer you a free therapy session, whether you wanted it or not. And so that night he had a free therapy session for us. He talked about community and love and compassion. He was frustrated that so many people in the world look at what makes us different before they see what makes us so similar. He asked why it is that we let the little things get in the way of how much we care about each other. And he had these long, gangly arms. And when he was coming in for a landing on a point, either to hold himself up, I'm not quite sure, or pull you in closer to make his point, he would drape one of those arms over your shoulder. That night, he draped an arm over my shoulder and he said, "You know what I wish we did more often is tell each other that we love each other." It was not long after that the most normal night of my life, on the most normal day of my life, became the extraordinary tragedy that everyone knows it to be. Just after 2 o'clock in the morning, I was washing my hands at a bathroom sink when a gunman charged through the front door of one of the safest spaces I've ever known. He opened fire into a crowd of mostly LGBTQ people of color, specifically mostly from the Latina community. Before he was done, hours later, he'd murdered 49 of our community members, our neighbors, our family members. I remember the sense of heartbreak for the first time when I learned that my best friends, Drew and Juan, the people who changed my life, the people who taught me it's okay to be you exactly as you are, were in normal fashion wrapped in each other's arms underneath their favorite disco ball, dancing with one another right in that man's line of fire. They were among the 49 people murdered that night, and that's what got me into this work. That's my connection to the fight to ending anti-LGBTQ hate violence. Because for maybe the first time in my life, I saw the big picture. I saw the role that each and every one of us plays in trying to create a better world for one another. 6 days after the shooting, we had a funeral service for Drew. And today, it's the hardest day I've ever had in my life. I remember trying to write my eulogy speech in the front seat, my hand shaking so hard I could barely steady the pen. His mom asked me to be a pallbearer that day. And as I was helping to push his casket down the aisle, I found myself gripping the pall really tightly. And it's because I didn't want to let go of my best friend until I found the right words to say goodbye. So we got to the front of the church and I looked down at his casket and I promised him very quietly that I would never stop fighting for a world that he would be proud of. And I believe firmly that the world that Drew would be proud of is a world that all of us can be proud of. And at its core, it's a world that sees hate violence eradicated. So I'm really proud to be in the work to end anti-LGBTQ hate violence and hate crimes. I'm really grateful to be here having this conversation. And thank you to both of you for all the work that you do.
Thank you, Brandon, for telling your story. And I'm so sorry for everything that you've been through. I can't even imagine what that must have been like. But your passion to keep fighting for LGBTQ plus individuals, I'm 100% sure is something that Drew would be so proud of.
Thank you. That means a lot.
Eli, what is your connection to this work of ending LGBTQ plus hate crimes and violence against LGBTQ plus individuals?
So my path is quite a bit different than Brandon's. I had actually been involved in activist efforts around LGBTQ issues since I was in high school, really. I went to a religious school that was pretty anti-LGBTQ, and so found a lot of solace in community organizations that worked on LGBTQ issues, particularly for youth. As a queer person and a gender nonconforming person, that was really important to me. I also worked on some of the campaigns when states were banning same-sex marriage. And so eventually work on those issues led me to a path of going to graduate school. And I actually wasn't sure that I wanted to study LGBTQ issues directly in graduate school. I was working on my PhD in New York City, and while I was there, same-sex marriage was legalized. I think a lot of people had the feeling of, oh, things are getting better, right? That sense of kind of normalcy that Brandon was talking about. We've always seen LGBTQ advocates have long seen same-sex marriage as one of those big victories. And so same-sex marriage had been legalized, but at the same time that I was pursuing my graduate degree, a man, Mark Carson, was murdered. A gay man was murdered in the West Village in New York City. And oftentimes when we think about this, though, the West Village is one of those places that's incredibly gay friendly, right? We're in a state where same-sex marriage had just been legalized, even though nationally it wasn't legalized yet. And people were asking the question over and over and over again, how is this happening? How is this happening now? When things are supposedly more accepting, why are we seeing this explosion in violence against LGBTQ folks? And so in light of that, my dissertation work was actually, I was interested in kind of understanding this from, an empirical data kind of approach. Okay, well, what are the reasons this is happening? How can I use my graduate training, my degree in sociology to help understand what's happening now? And so I ended up researching anti-LGBTQ hate crimes, the effects that has on individuals, the effects that has on communities, and also, how that's situated within the kind of larger structural context of the US. How do things like same-sex marriage impact hate crime victimization, as well as those kind of individual interpersonal level things that impact violence? And so that's really how I came to this work, with this idea that if we can have an understanding of why hate crimes are going on, then we can better implement policies that will not only support victims of anti-LGBTQ hate crimes, but also prevent them.
Thank you so much for all that. It's so important to talk about what the underlying cause for a problem is so that we can solve it. Because if we don't, I'm going to talk about this later on, but there's a sexual violence pyramid that was developed by a researcher. And at the very, very bottom, it mentions attitudes and beliefs and how attitudes and beliefs lead to violence, and how at the cause of everything is what you believe in. So that's really important to talk about. Brandon, can you tell us about hate crimes in Florida specifically, since you work for Equality Florida? And do you think Orlando has become more open and welcoming to the LGBTQ plus community since the Pulse tragedy?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So hate crimes law in Florida mirrors hate crimes law in a bunch of other places in this country. It does include protections for a number of groups, although it is not inclusive of all groups. And, I think what's important to note about hate crimes generally, outside of, what the law does or does not say, is that we've seen an increase in hate crimes across the board, not just here in Florida, but really across the country. Anti-LGBTQ hate crimes in particular have been on the rise. We know that, this is driven by a whole host of things, but, often it's driven by sort of rhetoric that is normalized. We've seen a lot of, anti-LGBTQ animus online. It's been, propagated on social media. We've certainly seen a rise in conversation about people of trans and non-binary identities. All of those things are fueling animus toward LGBTQ people. They're driving a spike in anti-LGBTQ hate crimes. And of course, we also know that those things directly impact people living at the intersections of marginalized identities. People who experience hate violence in the LGBTQ community are most often Black trans women. We know that Black trans women are more likely to experience not only violence, but also to be murdered in the community. And so, it's important for us to note that not only are hate crimes rising against all marginalized groups across the country and here in Florida, they're certainly rising against LGBTQ people. And of course, those who are most directly impacted are those living at the intersections of marginalized identities. It's also really important for us to note that, hate crimes come with a particular animus. That's what fuels them. That's the legal definition of a hate crime is about the animus that's fueling the crime. But there's a lot that happens after that crime is perpetrated. That compounds on top of people with marginalized identities, right? These are communities that, historically don't have access to the same resources. These are communities that, that don't have access to the same financial resources. These are communities often that, have language barriers and they're not getting resources in the language that they need. And so when a hate crime is perpetrated, not only is it fueled by this animus, and today we're talking about anti-LGBTQ animus specifically, but it's also preying on a community that's going to have a harder time recovering because of the barriers they face to care and to resources. And to the second part of your question about, how Orlando looks in the wake of the Pulse Nightclub tragedy, it's a really interesting dichotomy because, we're living in a time when Florida, I think on many levels, doesn't feel as welcoming and open to LGBTQ community. That's for a whole host of reasons. But at the same time, Orlando has done a lot of work to be inclusive and welcoming of the LGBTQ community. We've done a lot of work to, there's rainbow sidewalks, and the Lake Eola bandshell is painted in rainbows. And there's been a lot of work to provide new resources to the community. The center has grown in size. It's now offering new resources to people in the community. And you all at the Victim Service Center have done really important work to lift up the voices and lived experiences of LGBTQ people. So while there's a lot of work to do across the state of Florida, and we're really proud to be doing that work at Equality Florida, I think it's important for us to note that our commitment in Central Florida, and specifically in Orlando, to be a more inclusive, more welcoming, more open place where we really target resources toward the community that needs it most. That work is paying off. It has created a different environment here for LGBTQ people, and that's something to be proud of.
Thank you so much. That was very, very well said about describing the way that, Orlando has expanded since the Pulse tragedy. I think Orlando has done a lot in order to make sure that their resources are more available to LGBTQ plus individuals. So, Eli, you've mentioned a bit about your research. What did your research specifically highlight about hate crimes nationally?
So I think one of the most important things that my research highlights is the importance of climate for the context in which anti-LGBTQ hate crimes occur. So one of the things that I did want to do was look at those larger social contexts in which crime occurs. And so I did things like look at the types of legislation that actually impact rates of victimization in states. So for example, same-sex marriage bans and the passage of same-sex marriage, did that actually have an impact on hate crimes either increasing or decreasing? Things like states that actually implement legislation outlawing hate crimes against people based on either sexual orientation or gender identity. And also looking at how those crimes have shifted over time. And, as Brandon rightly points out, that there have been some significant increases, in the 2010s of hate crime victimization. And when we look at some of those larger social contexts as well, though, we do see that things that impact the climate for LGBTQ people impact whether people experience hate crime victimization. So, for example, the legalization of same-sex marriage caused decreases in rates of hate crime victimization, whereas bans against same-sex marriage actually caused increases in hate crimes in those states. And so in this sense, I think it's really important that you pointed out the linking of those kind of thoughts, ideas, that those individual level thoughts and ideas. Well, we also have like social thoughts and ideas, right? And so the social climate, when it tends to be negative for LGBTQ folks, they're more likely to be victims of hate crimes. And this is exactly how that kind of pyramid of violence works, in which these thoughts, ideas, etc., trickle up into behaviors being outright violence against LGBTQ folks. So in looking at the way that those crimes are categorized, typically sexual orientation is one bundle of crimes, and then gender identity is a separate bundle of crimes when we look at it in terms of crime reporting. And what we know is that, as Brandon pointed out, people who are multiply marginalized, so LGBTQ people of color, are often may experience dual victimization, so being the victim of a hate crime based on both their sexual orientation or gender identity and their race or ethnicity. And we also find that even though lesbian, gay, bisexual people and transgender people experience similar types of crimes, the actual after effects of those crimes tend to be worse for trans people, particularly for trans people of color. So an assault against, for example, a trans woman of color is probably statistically more likely to be more violent, more likely to result in severe injury and or hospitalization or even death than one committed against, for example, a cisgender white gay man. And so people's identities are a huge factor in how the violence is actually enacted against those individuals. And so I think that it's important that we also consider when not only are there more immediate ramifications, for example, if you're having to be hospitalized, right, you're missing work, there are financial impacts to you. As Brandon pointed out, those are often the people who are already in precarious positions. And so when we think about the totality of these crimes, I think that there's an important role for victim services to play in making sure that people's needs are adequately addressed. Unfortunately, one of the things that I also found in my research is that LGBTQ victims of violence are not as likely to seek services, sometimes because those services aren't available, or sometimes because they're not sure if the services that are available are going to be friendly to LGBTQ folks, which is why it's so important that, there are organizations that are, that are supportive of LGBTQ issues and that also make themselves allies of the LGBTQ community to let people know that if something happens to you, this is a safe place where you can turn to. You will be supported, your needs will be met.
Thank you so much for mentioning that, because that's exactly what my role is. My role is to basically go out into the community and make sure that the VSC is known in as many LGBTQ plus spaces as possible, because basically a survivor can tell someone that they've been assaulted at any moment, which is why I think it's so important to train everyone how to react to a disclosure and how to support survivors. So I have a training specifically for LGBTQ plus sexual violence that I give out in the community to many different groups, because LGBTQ plus people exist everywhere. And it's really important for everyone to know how to connect survivors to not only the VSC, but like all other resources within their community, so that the survivors are properly cared for, and they know that when they come through our doors, that they're going to have people that are going to respect their identities, respect their pronouns, respect their sexual orientation, that they're not going to be discriminated against, because that is so important. They've already been through something traumatic, such as sexual assault or a hate crime, such as, for example, a connection of sexual violence and hate crimes is known as corrective rape, which is basically sexual assault against an individual because of their sexual orientation. So the survivors, the populations that are the most affected by corrective rape are lesbians, bisexual women, and asexual individuals, because lesbians, their homosexuality is often viewed as a sin, and so they can be victims of corrective rape in order to quote unquote correct their homosexuality, because it's viewed as wrong, which it is not. And bisexual women are at increased rates of being victims of sexual violence. I believe it's 46% of bisexual women have experienced rape in their lifetime. And then asexual individuals are also at high risks, because our society in general is very sexualized. And so when asexual individuals don't feel sexual attraction, that is also viewed as wrong and something that needs to be corrected, even though being asexual and being LGBTQI in general is completely normal. So it's important to make sure that services are accessible and welcoming to all LGBTQ plus individuals, so that they're not re-traumatized after having endured a sexual assault because someone won't respect their gender identity or won't respect their sexual orientation.
Can I add one thing to that? I'll also say that sexual violence is also something that is especially common for trans folks to experience. There are lots of trans women who are sexually assaulted after either disclosing or having disclosed their trans identity. Likewise, for non-binary people, corrective rape is a serious issue. And for trans men, again, who, their sex assigned at birth is discovered, they will also not infrequently experience corrective rape as a quote punishment almost for their gender identity. And so it's definitely a serious problem that many members of the LGBTQ community face for various different reasons or beliefs, but all of them incorrect.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. That's really important. And I actually, although I knew that transgender men were also at high risks of corrective rape, I did not know about everything that you just mentioned. So I'm learning something too. So to both Eli and Brandon, why is it important to talk about this, talk about anti-LGBTQ plus hate crimes?
Well, listen, the first thing to do is to increase awareness, right? We can't address a problem if we haven't identified the problem and made the public aware that it exists. If you live in, a community, a neighborhood where you're generally quite safe, you may not realize that these things are happening, and certainly may not realize the degree to which they're happening to your LGBTQ neighbors, community members, family members, even. And so the first step is for us to have conversations like this one. It's to educate people not only on who is a part of the LGBTQ plus community, but what different experiences they're having in the world around us. And then the hope is that awareness can lead to solutions, right? That we can have a conversation about redirecting resources to where they need to go. One of the things that I think Orlando has been most proud of, still work to be done, but most proud of since the Pulse Nightclub tragedy, is the way in which we've helped to redirect financial and other resources toward multiply marginalized communities, right? So the Contigo Fund, for instance, is an organization that was founded in the wake of the shooting that has really done a lot of work to get grant dollars directly to organizations being led by and doing services for LGBTQ people of color, and very specifically trans people of color. They had the All Black Lives Fund that they started after the murder of George Floyd. And of course, that allowed grant dollars to go to organizations being run by Black trans women. These communities, are aware of what's happening. We're most acutely aware of what our lived experiences are. And by the way, in many cases, these communities also know what solutions are necessary. They know how to get resources directly to people who need them. And so shifting that focus to try to, not only raise awareness, but then deliver resources directly to those organizations and groups that know how best to serve their communities is really important. But all of that starts by having these necessary conversations, identifying the issues, talking about the communities most directly impacted, digging into Eli's research about, where some of this is originating from, what is fueling anti-LGBTQ violence, talking about the human cost so that we understand, at the end of the day, why this is so critical for us all to be invested in. And then we can work on solutions together.
And, I'll just echo everything that Brandon said, absolutely. And I think the goal is to get to a place where we actually have those solutions, right? Where people have the resources they need because we're aware of these issues. But then we can really start focusing, once people have those basic needs established and met, then we can start focusing on resources for prevention. How do we make it so that this is not an issue that anyone ever experiences, right? So what are those interventions? What are those solutions? Because, I think especially when we think about hate crimes, not just those against LGBTQ folks, but racial and ethnic minorities and other groups, it's really about how do we prevent people from being seen as unequal in the first place or somehow deserving of violence? Because that's what really drives hate crimes, is that socially, some people are viewed to be seen as acceptable targets of violence. And that's what we have to really get to prevent hate crimes from occurring.
So that was a really, really good point. It is incredibly important to work on prevention, because if we only have services for after this happens and not before this happens, then nothing is going to change. So that's why it's so important to talk about why this is happening, the fact that this is happening, because obviously it's, first of all, many people that are not members of the LGBTQ plus community or not members of any marginalized populations in general don't know that hate crimes are as frequent as they are, and don't know that, for example, sexual violence again is much higher within LGBTQ plus populations. So that's why it's really important to have these conversations. So Eli, a question that a lot of people ask when we're having this conversation about, protecting LGBTQ plus individuals and ending hate crimes is, how can allies do better to assist and support LGBTQ plus individuals?
I think that's a really great question. And a lot of that is about education, right? Educating yourself. Listening to a podcast like this is obviously helpful. A lot of people, again, as you mentioned, don't know about the violence that LGBTQ people experience. Or the fact that this is a common and pervasive fear in LGBTQ communities of being victimized by violence, right? And so educating yourself to understand, who LGBTQ folks are, what are the inequalities that LGBTQ folks experience, how that intersects with other identities, right? So understanding, for example, there are huge problems with poverty, for example, among trans individuals. Well, that's because trans folks experience a lot of discrimination in employment, in education, in even trying to access those jobs, right? And so I think that if we have a broader understanding of the multiple types of marginalization and oppression that LGBTQ folks experience, then we're coming to the table for these conversations a lot more informed, right? And then we can start saying, all right, well, what can I do to support? How can I invest my energies in a way that's actually going to be helpful and beneficial to that community? And so, as Brandon mentioned, providing resources to groups that are actually doing that work that actually are community-led efforts. Because there are a lot of fantastic folks in the LGBTQ community running organizations that do provide those kind of direct services to people, in their own communities, because we know what our communities are experiencing. And that's not to say that there aren't also other organizations doing that work, or to undervalue the work that allied organizations also do. I think all of these can play a role, but knowing what's out there, knowing about these issues in the first place, and educating yourself, I think it is a really important first step.
Thank you so much. It is really important for allies to educate themselves, so that because LGBTQ, anyone can talk to an LGBTQ plus individual any day, and so it's really important to educate yourself in order to not only validate the person you're talking to, but also, and respect the person that you're talking to, but also to to try to understand, or at least try to see what LGBTQ plus individuals have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So, Brandon, regarding the Pulse Nightclub Tragedy, I want to talk a little bit about what you do to honor the loved ones that you lost that day.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. And it goes back to what we're talking about in terms of supporting community efforts, right, to make the world a better place. I'm really proud to work full-time at Equality Florida. It means I get to, get deep in the policy weeds. I get to be a little political. I get to, be a firebrand on Twitter sometimes. And all of that is really great work. And I'm thrilled to do it. But at the end of the day, what is really going to change the world, what's really going to shift our thinking, change hearts and minds, as they say, is to create a world where young people understand one another better, where they treat each other with dignity and respect, and where young people who have, systemically been shut out of opportunities are given a chance to thrive. That's how we change the future. And so in the month that followed Pulse, we were sitting around Drew's kitchen island. His landlord let us have access to his apartment for a few weeks afterward. We were drinking a bottle of his favorite wine, and we were talking about what a world that Drew would be proud of might actually look like. What would it look like to carry on the legacy of Drew in a way that allowed him to be more than just a name on a wall somewhere or a faceless, victim of gun violence in America? And for us, the answer was really quite clear, because not only was Drew a mental health professional, which meant that for him, giving people access to their fullest self was his life's work and what he was most passionate about. But very specifically, when he was in high school, and I think it was 2004, he launched the very first Gay Straight Alliance student club at his school in Polk County, Florida, which, if you're familiar with Polk County, may not have been the most friendly space for him to launch a program like that. He had to do a lot of changing of hearts and minds, but he was really passionate about it. He wanted a space where young people could go, learn more about one another, and for LGBTQ young people specifically to feel comfortable being themselves. And so we launched the Drew Project, which is still led by our little mighty band of board members. There's 3 of us who run that organization. And for us, the mission was always very simple. We were going to continue the legacy of creating those Gay Straight Alliance student clubs in schools. We wanted to support them with the resources they needed to be productive when they're together. And ultimately, we wanted to build an on-ramp from there into higher education so that those young people who are leading GSAs go out into the world and fulfill their dreams. We've been really proud to do that work. We authored the country's most comprehensive guidebook for those Gay Straight Alliance clubs that's now been downloaded in, I think, 40 different states and 15 different countries around the world. We've given out nearly $10,000 in small dollar grants to Gay Straight Alliance student clubs so that they can buy swag or go on a field trip. We helped one Gay Straight Alliance student club here in Florida actually take a day trip to Pulse Nightclub and then to the Orange County History Center's Pulse Nightclub exhibit one June. And our flagship program at the Drew Project is what we call the Spirit of Drew Awards, which are our college scholarships. I just looked at the numbers yesterday or the day before, and it looks like we're at about $115,000 in college scholarships given over the last 6 years to aspiring and rising LGBTQ leaders. And what I'm most proud of with that program is that people who embody the spirit of Drew, that compassionate, caring, kind human being who wanted to make the world a better place, do a lot of different things in our society. It's not just about giving scholarships only to political science majors who are going to go off and run for president someday. It's about empowering young people who are doing a whole host of things. We've got LGBTQ students who are in STEM, science, technology, math, all of that, who are, going to go on and hopefully cure cancer someday. We've got LGBTQ students we've given scholarships to who are in veterinary school, who are going to go out and make life better for our furry friends. We've got, LGBTQ students who are passionate about putting an end to climate change, who are going to try to keep the world habitable for us for a really long time. Each and every one of them embody the spirit of Drew, which is that passion for leaving the world better than they found it. And so the Drew Project has been the way I have tried to honor Drew each and every day, because the policy work is important. The political fights for me are really important and something I'm passionate about. But creating pathways for young people to achieve their dreams is how we're really going to change the world.
Thank you so much. And I absolutely love what you've done with the Drew Project. I remember I was, I think, a senior in high school or a freshman in college when I first heard about it. And it's really amazing, all of the work that you do and all of the people that are going to go on and do great things just from like the financial assistance that they get from the Drew Project. So really beautiful.
I just wanted to call out one other thing that I'm very, very proud of. And that is that we launched this year for the first time debt relief scholarships, grants, I guess we're calling them debt relief grants. So these are to students who've already accrued student debt. They still embody that, spirit of Drew. They still have that same passion for making the world better. They've just already finished their education and are still carrying some student debt burden. This year, I believe we gave 3 of those scholarships of $15,000 in student debt relief. I'm really proud of that because I'm someone who still has a little bit of student debt. And I know that there are so many people out there who are overlooked, who are doing really important work in our communities and are holding on to that debt burden that may actually be holding them back from doing more good work in our communities, right? When you've got a choice between, making that student loan payment on time or finding the job that really hits the sweet spot of your passion, of course, you've got to, live up to your financial obligations. And so for us to be able to free some folks from that burden, for us to be able to relieve some of that debt so that the possibilities truly are endless for them, has felt really good. So I'm looking forward to expanding that program for us in the years to come.
That's amazing. I'm so glad that you get to not only help people that are studying in the future, but people that have studied in the past to try to make the world a better place is really wonderful. So, Eli, what are the effects of hate crimes on LGBTQ plus individuals, specifically like emotionally and psychologically, and why is it important to really talk about that?
Yeah, so there are a lot of impacts to LGBTQ individuals who have been victimized by hate crimes or hate violence. So in the short term, obviously there can be physical impacts, injury, you know, even injuries leading to hospitalization. In the most severe instances, people are killed by hate crimes, right? And so there are very serious, both immediate and sometimes long-term physical health consequences of hate crime victimization. Likewise, there are mental health implications for the victims of hate crimes. So things ranging from anxiety to depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. What we do know is that because the fear of hate crimes is something that is kind of constantly looming for many LGBTQ folks, particularly for trans folks, that there are even repercussions, health repercussions and mental health repercussions of trying to avoid victimization. So for example, there are numerous trans people, more than half of trans people actually have reported experiencing negative health consequences of things like not going to the bathroom in public. So either actually dehydrating themselves or holding it in to the point where they experience things like bladder infections because the risk of using the bathroom in a public setting puts them at risk of violence. It's literally, it can be for trans people risking your life to use the restroom. And so the both the physical, but also the psychological repercussions of that are incredibly traumatic. We also have to think of the larger impact to communities, right? Because hate crimes are not just about individual victims. When someone is targeted for a hate crime, they are targeted on the basis of their membership in a particular social group. And so, yes, even though the action might only be carried out against that one individual, it's that one individual as the symbol of a larger community. And so, in that sense, hate crimes are meant to cause fear, to cause terror in the communities that are being targeted. And so, even folks in the community who weren't the direct victim of that violence are still being indirectly victimized. And again, that can cause things like depression, anxiety, and other negative mental health consequences. And so when we think about hate crimes, we can't only think about the individual, which of course there are serious repercussions to the individuals who are victimized, but we also have to think about the damage that does to our broader communities and the fear and distrust that crimes like this create.
Thank you so much for mentioning that. It's really important to talk about how people that are part of like specific groups that are likely to be targeted for hate crimes will change their behavior just so they don't become victims, just so that they don't get attacked. They'll, like, I'm sure for trans individuals, and I'm saying this as a cis person, so of course correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm sure trans individuals, like, maybe sometimes they'll change their whole like outfit simply because they don't want to be seen as trans and they want to be more cis passing for their own safety. So that's really important. Thank you very much for talking about that. And the next thing that I really want to talk about is what leads to violence and how can we end violence against LGBTQ plus individuals.
I'm really, really glad that you both brought up the discussion about changing behavior, right, in order to avoid victimization, because I think that leads us into this question about how do we stop it? How do we put a stop to violence against LGBTQ people? When I tell people that Pulse was a safe space, I like to give them some examples. Pulse is one of the first places on earth where I held hands with someone that I had a crush on without looking over my shoulder first. Pulse is one of the first places on earth where I didn't stiffen my wrists or deepen my voice to avoid being detected as a gay man in public. Pulse is one of the first places I ever wore a very skinny pair of jeans without being worried about walking to my car afterward. That is what safety can feel like for LGBTQ people. Those are just a few examples, but those are the things that LGBTQ individuals carry every single day when they walk out the door. And at the core of those things is an animus toward LGBTQ people based on misconceptions, based on mischaracterizations, and those things lead to the dehumanization of LGBTQ people. You can't get to a place where you inflict harm and violence on someone else until you have so dehumanized them that you see that violence and harm as justifiable, right? And so part of the way we have to combat that, part of the way we have to work to end violence against LGBTQ people in society is to humanize LGBTQ people. Think about the fight for LGBTQ civil rights to this point in time. The battle for marriage equality was not won because of an and or an or on a page. It was won because people held hands with each other bravely and said, my love deserves to be recognized. This is love the same as yours is. You think about the fight for non-discrimination protections and what that looked like. It looked like courageous transgender and non-binary people saying that I don't deserve to be fired because I dress a certain way at work or because I ask for my name and pronoun to be respected. It throughout history has been the courage of LGBTQ people to share their stories and the willingness of people around them to see them as family members, friends, neighbors, community members that has pushed the needle forward. And so at the end of the day, if we're going to push back against violence against LGBTQ people, it begins and ends with humanizing the LGBTQ experience and causing the world around us to pause and to see one another as people first. I'm thinking about that last conversation that I had with Drew, where he talked about how often we look at our differences before we see our similarities. The way to get to a place free of violence against one another, free of hate violence in particular, is to see our similarities first, to understand that at the end of the day, we are all people. And of course, I think in the short term, because that's a long-term goal, pie in the sky, in the short term, we have to do better about educating people on the ramifications of hate violence. We have to do better at getting resources to those who are most likely to be victimized in hate crimes or hate violence. And we have to challenge one another to do better, to be better allies, to educate the people in our lives. I, as a cisgender man, have to challenge the spaces that I'm in. I have to, put my privilege on the line to try to create a safer world for those without cisgender male privilege. And so we've got a lot of work to do, I think, as community members. But at the end of the day, our goal should be to humanize LGBTQ people and help the world see one another as people first.
And I 100% agree with everything Brandon has said. The thing that I would really add to that is that it's not just about our similarities, right? Because I think that ends up becoming a very easy thing for people to accept, to say, oh, well, okay, LGBTQ folks, maybe you're with someone of the same sex, but really your relationships, in terms of structure, look pretty much like our heterosexual or straight relationships, right? But what about the places where those might look different, right? What about the differences that trans and non-binary folks experience? What about actually valuing our differences as well? Saying, what are the value added things that I can gain from your experience because it's not mine? And I think that's one of the harder places where we fail to see each other's humanity, is actually in valuing differences. Accepting each other's similarities is a good starting point. And I think that overall, we have gotten much better as a society about doing that, when we can say, well, here are the ways we're similar. But what about the ways that we can value and celebrate each other's differences as well? And I think that when we get to that place, we will have made some really significant progress.
Both of everything that both of you said is true. And I think at the very core of everything is that we have to listen to each other. Every person has a different story to tell. Every person has had different experiences. So it's really important to listen to each other's stories and, of course, validate each other's experiences, because we never know what the other person is going through. And, the first thing that I'm going to bring this back to supporting survivors, of course, like the first thing that we tell people when they ask, oh, how do I support a loved one who has been sexually assaulted? The first thing that we say is that you have to start by believing. So you have to believe their story, because unfortunately we live in a society where victims are often blamed and not believed for what happened to them. And so you have to believe them that they are the experts in what happened to them and that their experiences are real. And the second thing that we also say is that you have to listen, because it's really hard for people to talk about certain topics. And it's, we live in a world where many people disagree with each other. But at the end of the day, we're all human beings. And so in order to grow, we have to listen. Thank you to Brandon and Eli for joining us today. Everything that you've said today is so incredibly important, and your experiences and your expertise has taught me so much, and hopefully taught a lot to whoever whoever is listening. So thank you so much for coming.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So I hope you all have a wonderful day. And to whoever is listening, thank you for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free, confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone.